Okay, day 81 of Bible in 90 days, which means we only have 9 more days to go before we finish the whole Bible, reading it from Genesis to Revelation. We're reading it just like you would, a novel, chapter by chapter, page by page, without skipping any of the details, just to get a real good feel of what the outline is of the Bible. So in the moment, yes, we're going to be finishing off the book of Acts, Acts 17 all the way to chapter 28, where we've been talking about Paul and how he was, converted, and the things that were happening in the early church, and the, challenges that they faced, and, the things that really characterized, the early church. So we continue Acts 17. We hear that Paul and Silas in Thessalonica, and they're talking about why it was necessary for Jesus to die. We hear that the Jews there became jealous and started causing trouble again. Paul and Silas went to Berea, where the Jews there were more receptive. These Jews, they checked the scriptures to make sure that the stuff that Paul and Silas were saying, were true. The Jews follow them again there, and cause trouble. Then Paul goes off to, to Athens. We hear about Paul's time in Athens, arguing and debating with the people there as to, the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, and proving it, from the scriptures. We hear that Paul teaches on idolatry, the true nature of God, and the coming final judgment. Acts chapter 18, Paul goes to Corinth, and in a few books time we're going to be reading about the letter to the Corinthians. But Paul goes to Corinth and meets Aquila and Priscilla. They were in the same trade as tent makers, so he actually used to work with them. We hear about Silas and Timothy finally making it from Macedonia because they had been left behind, and Paul was still teaching. Paul meets another guy called Titus, and through a vision he is actually told to stay in Corinth, because Jesus was saying there were a lot of people there that needed to hear the the gospel. Paul is brought before Gallio, but the case was thrown out because Gallio was saying this is nothing to do with the crime that's being committed. It's to do with your laws and your regulations, etc. We hear that Paul leaves for Syria with Aquila and Priscilla, and we hear about their time that they spent in Ephesus, and we hear about a guy called Apollo in Ephesus who was well versed in the scriptures, but he needed correction. So Aquila and Priscilla had to take him aside and just kind of teach him a few more things. Acts chapter 19. We hear about Paul in Ephesus, and how some people were baptized there, a revival in Ephesus, and a lot of people actually turned to Christ in Ephesus. We hear about the 7 sons of Sceva, who, although they were not 100% genuine, they thought they could simply say the things that Paul was saying, in order to cast out some evil spirits. But this actually didn't turn out very well for them, and they got beat, by these evil spirits, and the glory of God was actually shown. It was shown because people were like, wow, this is actually the real thing. You can't be going around, doing, impersonations or whatever. We have a guy called Demetrius, a silversmith in Ephesus, who actually causes trouble for Paul, because usually it was about self-preservation. Because if you can imagine, everybody was beginning to turn to to Christ, so nobody was still buying these idols and whatever. And because Demetrius, this was his his job, his livelihood, he knew that Paul in this case was was his enemy, so he starts a whole heap of trouble. Acts chapter 20, we hear more about Paul's travels and encouragement in the region, and Paul raises a young man from the dead. Then obviously his journeys continue after that. We hear about Paul's message to the to the elders in Ephesus, things about missions, obedience and suffering that was to come. He then says farewell to them, tells them to stay alert because Jesus was coming back at any point, and to to stay generous. Acts chapter 21. We hear about Paul's constant warnings, not to go to Jerusalem. So prophets kept coming to Paul to tell them that not a lot of good things were going to happen for him in Jerusalem, so he shouldn't go, but he was more eager to actually to go. We hear about the stop over at Philip the evangelist's house, and more warnings again for Paul, that Paul, please do not go to Jerusalem because things are not going to be well for you there. Paul debriefs the apostles in Jerusalem, so Paul goes ahead and gets to Jerusalem, and we hear about him debriefing the apostles. We hear about the issue of the the zealous Jews who who come up and trying to cause some issues, but for the sake of peace, Paul takes a vow and joins some of the people that were taking a vow at that time. Jews caused trouble again with Paul in Jerusalem, and this time it was about the law, and they were accusing him of things that he was doing regarding the law. The authorities get involved to stop the the commotion there, because it was getting to be a really hot topic. Acts chapter 22, Paul addresses the crowd about his history, from conversion all to the present. We hear that there was more uproar, and Paul is saved from flogging because he was a Roman citizen. Another date is then set to hear why Paul was hated so much, because at this point everybody was just causing trouble, for Paul, accusing him of certain things that he hadn't done. So obviously now the the authorities were involved. Acts chapter 23, Paul, whilst giving his defense, he exploits the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because in these councils that were sitting Paul down and trying to find out what the issue was and why all this commotion was going on, there were Pharisees and Sadducees, but they believed slightly different things. So Paul was exploiting those and managed to get a stay in execution. We hear that in Acts 23, Jesus appears to Paul and encourages him, to continue, and that he would actually be able to make his way to, to Rome. We have about Paul's nephew uncovering a plot to kill Paul, and that very night Paul is sent to, to Felix. Acts chapter 24. The high priests and the elders lay their false accusations against Paul before Felix. Paul makes his defense, and Felix adjourns the case. Felix is then succeeded by a guy called Porcius Festus, whilst Paul is actually still in in prison, or held there. Acts chapter 25, we're about Paul before Festus, because he had to make his defense, before, Festus as well. And then at that point, he appeals to Caesar, because these people, he felt that, things were not going anywhere and he was not going to get the justice that he needed. So he appealed, to Caesar, so that Caesar could hear his case, in Rome. King Agrippa shows up and asks to hear, Paul out as well. Acts 26, we hear that Paul recounts his whole story before Agrippa, and Paul cheekily also tries there to convert Agrippa. So we see Paul's heart, that everybody, would come to know Jesus. Agrippa sees Paul's innocence, but since Paul had already appealed to Caesar, Agrippa actually says, listen, if Paul had not appealed to Caesar, we would have let him go. But because he has, he then has to go and see, Caesar and have his case heard there. Acts 27, we hear about Paul's journey, to Rome, and the favor that, that followed him. And we'll see about all the shipwreck events, that happened, all the trouble that they went through as they were trying to sail, to Rome. Acts 28, last chapter of today, we hear about the perception of Paul on the island of Malta after the after the shipwreck. How if essentially initially they thought that he had a demon or he was some kind of murderer or whatever, but later on, because of the signs and wonders that were happening, they actually started to think he was some kind of a god. We hear that Paul heals people on the island, and finally they get to to Rome. Whilst he's in Rome, Paul invites the Jewish elders, and he recounts the events of everything that had happened so far, to them. Paul also tries to, to convince some of them to be Christians, but some obviously deny, the story about Jesus being the Messiah and, dying for the people, etc. But this was simply prophecy that was being fulfilled, that some people would be told about Jesus and they would not, they would not listen. So the book ends with, with Paul in Rome, I think, whilst awaiting trial or to be heard by Caesar, and we hear that he continues to preach. So it kind of just ends off there. There really isn't a proper conclusion to the book of Acts, probably because that was the church as it was growing and how things were happening at that time. And that's where we find ourselves. So tomorrow is day 82, where we look at what is arguably the best book in the in the New Testament, or in the whole Bible, according to some theologians. Maybe you should read it for yourself and find out why. But yeah, let's take a look tomorrow and see what the book of Romans holds. See you tomorrow.